True Crime Conversations acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast was recorded on. Oh, hi there. It's your host, Claire Murphy, and today I'm bringing you a powerful episode from our archives that you might have missed. Perfect for some extra weekend listening. It's an episode where Gemma Barth interviewed Laura McConnell, who grew up in a fundamentalist cult with no name. Along with no official title, the group also claims to have no registration around the world, no formal hierarchy, and no official place of worship. According to Laura, it's this secrecy and denial that has allowed abuse to flourish within the community. In this episode, she exposes what she witnessed and experienced inside the group she calls the truth.
This episode contains discussions of sexual assault and mental health struggles. Please take care while listening. It's 1999 in Melbourne, and Laura McConnell is sifting through photo after photo on a microfiche at her university library, searching for old newspaper clippings. She's only 6 months into her new life, after escaping an ultra-conservative cult known as the Truth. After feeling uncomfortable in her world for years, Laura made the enormous decision to stop believing and move away from her community in Western New South Wales. But in her world, that meant saying goodbye to her family, her friends, everyone she's ever known. She thought if she left, she'd die. That's what she was told. But here she still was, and something was bugging her. Laura grew up believing that 2 teenagers from her community, Narelle and Stephen, died in 1992 because they listened to the rock band Nirvana. That's what she'd been told. But the story has niggled at her over the years. Something doesn't feel right, and she's keen to investigate. Eventually, she stumbles across an article. Suicide? The siblings had taken their own lives because they didn't want to live within the confines of their strict religious upbringing anymore. Wow, she'd been lied to. What else were they lying about? As Laura continues to reflect and research the life she left, she realises something. The world she grew up in was a cult guilty of numerous crimes. Crimes that went unspoken. Crimes that were normalised by those around her. Grooming, sexual abuse, domestic violence, spiritual abuse, financial abuse. She realises another thing too. These crimes she witnessed were overwhelmingly affecting one half of the group, the women. Women who grew up with nowhere to run, no path to freedom, and no voice of their own. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. But this month, instead of looking at specific criminal cases, we're focusing in on the people behind the scenes of crime. In the eyes of the community she left, Laura McConnell is a traitor, simply because she doesn't believe anymore. But she hasn't gone quietly. Instead, Laura is very loudly and very proudly trying to get the word out about the dangers of the truth. She doesn't want the children and teenagers growing up inside to believe what she did, that there's no way out. She wants to be the inspiration she wishes she had, someone who followed a different path. Perhaps what makes the truth so dangerous is its secretiveness. It has no proper name, no official places of worship, and no doctrinal statements other than the Bible itself. Instead, everything is passed down in person, from generation to generation. There are no priests or ministers. Instead, those in charge are called workers. They encourage members to spend their lives proving their worth to God and Jesus, often through acts of suffering. Today's guest grew up in the truth before making her escape at the age of 19. Laura joins us now. Laura, how do I even refer to this group or church that you grew up in? Is it true that there's not really a name for it?
Yeah, it is. So they claim to have been started in the beginning. So they claim not to have a name. And in fact, they claim not to have any registrations around the world, no formal kind of church hierarchy, no name.
So for the purposes of this interview, how should we refer to it? How do you refer to the group?
I personally call them the truth because that's what I grew up calling them, the truth or the friends or the way. In Australia, I think internally, and people who've left call it the truth. In America and the US, they use that less. They say the 2 by 2s. But I'm Australian, so I tend to use the truth.
Brilliant. We'll call them the truth. You said it started at the beginning.
Apparently.
Apparently. Can it be pinpointed back to I'm going to say man, because I assume it's a man, a place, a person, a country?
It'll be no surprise to anyone outside the truth to learn that, in fact, it was not started by God or by Jesus. It was started by a man in Ireland in the late 1890s, William Irvine, and then spread to other parts of the world from there. Came out of a very interesting time in Ireland where several fundamentalist groups came out at the same time, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Exclusive Brethren, and also the Truth came out of this time in Ireland as well. So it was a time of quite a lot of upheaval and where people were searching for something different to mainstream Christianity. And these fundamentalist groups sprung up. The Truth happens to be quite a secretive version of it, which doesn't share a lot of its background and claims to have no name, for instance.
And they call themselves a religion? Is that what they are?
They refer to themselves as a non-denominational loose group of Christians when pushed.
Right.
So you have to push quite hard to get that information from them. And part of that is that none of us are really taught anything else about Christianity outside the group. So we can't, as lay people, usually even explain what our beliefs are or where they fit within the Christian spectrum of beliefs or in fact within the spectrum of religion full stop, because we're not taught anything. We're kept quite in the dark about not only our beginnings and our belief structure, but also about what other Christianity even is. So at a push, yes, they're described as very loose, home-based Christians who read the Bible and are dictated to by the Bible. And that's really all they can tell you about where they sit in the Christian spectrum.
So I guess my next question was, what are the beliefs? Are there any? I guess looking back, you could probably pinpoint them.
Yeah, we're told that there really are no rules, a bit like the name thing. There's really no rules. You're spirit-led. So you're led by the Bible, right? You read the Bible and you'll interpret it. And the people around you, the men around you normally, will interpret the Bible for you. We had a very literal interpretation of the King James Bible, a very conservative, very extreme, fundamentalist interpretation of the King James Bible. We are led to believe that women should be tightly controlled in terms of their dress and their appearance. We are taught to keep ourselves separate from the world, which is also something common in fundamentalism in general, as is control of women and children and girls. The core beliefs are really very extreme in terms of women's sexuality, gender, appearance, that we should be modest at all times. And a lot of that is dictated to us by older men in our families and communities. And, things like TVs and radios and pop music when I was growing up were forbidden. It is a little looser these days, although most people don't have a TV openly. They'll have it in a cupboard where it can be shut away and hidden. Lots of people now have computers and the internet, but that was also forbidden when I was growing up. I live very sheltered lives. So there's this idea that we are in the world, but we are not of the world. So we don't consume things in the world the same way that mainstream Christians do. We are in this world, living in it, but we don't consume things the same way.
And is it a belief that the world is going to end one day? Is that part of it?
Yeah. So, well, again, we don't openly discuss that as a lot of other Christian groups do, that, that there's going to be this end of the world. That is basically what a lot of the control is about in the group, in that they really fundamentally believe that Jesus is going to return at any moment and he is going to select from the people in the world the best, or a certain group of people who have behaved in a very certain way, coincidentally, the way that they have interpreted the Bible inside the truth. And he will nominate those people to go back and be in heaven, and everybody else is going to hell. Ultimately, when it boils down to it, all of this behavior and all of this control that happens within the group is a terrible fear about the world ending any minute and all of us going to hell.
Is there a date? Are we working towards a
No,
date?
unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know. When you do a lot of research into cultic groups, even the ones that have a date, the date moves constantly
Right.
and nobody ever says, oh, by the way, that date's moved. Maybe this is a crock of shit. But even the ones that do have a date, nobody ever seems to do anything with it. But no, there is no date. It's just imminent. Any second, Jesus is returning. And we literally live in fear that we're going to turn around the corner as a woman wearing a pair of jeans and that Jesus is going to magically reappear and see us in a pair of jeans and be like, off to hell for you.
Wow. Just how big is this group? Because it doesn't have a name. From my understanding, there's no real places of worship. There's no church or anything like that. It's very elusive. So how is this able to spread? How big is this group?
So there has been a lot of turmoil in the past couple of decades. Certainly in Australia, there was a lot of people who left in the 90s. There was a big falling out in Canada in the late 90s as well, and a lot of people fell away. It is very hard to get an understanding of how many people are in the group worldwide because with no registered entity, there's not a lot of records that people can access, especially people outside the group like myself. We sort of believe that a group of people who've left are sort of the opinion there used to be around 200,000 worldwide. There is probably more like 50,000 now, I would say, perhaps even less. There is a big reckoning happening in America at the moment with a lot of abuse allegations coming to light, and I would say the number is falling rapidly by the day. Yeah, when I was growing up, I would have said there was around 50,000 here in Australia, but I would say that number is 10 now, at a guess. But you're right, there's no church buildings, so Truth believes that church buildings are worldly and that we worship in family homes. So we worship in the living rooms and the lounge rooms of our community, of one of the more senior men or families in our community will hold that. We have got a history of using things like scout halls and school libraries and whatnot to have services on a Sunday afternoon to try and encourage outsiders to attend. Once a year, there is a large event called a convention, and there is a ground that is owned by a wealthy family, for instance, in a state. That could be called church property, but in theory, there is no church property and no church buildings.
So in Australia, are there some common towns or states where there are more people inside this group?
Yes, there are. Again, I've been out now over 20 years, so I think it has changed a little since my childhood in terms of where people congregate together. But like a lot of fundamentalist groups, not just Christianity, but also Judaism and Islam, families and communities tend to congregate together in similar suburbs, in similar towns. And I think there can be a bit of a misconception that people from cultic backgrounds live in kind of compounds, but that's really often not the reality. We just tend to congregate together in family groups and community groups because often our work is very intertwined. Our families work in family businesses. And money is very tied up in each other's lives and investments and work. So personally, my own community comes from rural New South Wales, and there are certainly family groups that congregate together in places like Dubbo, places like Mudgee, Cowra, rural places outside the major centres. That's not to say there are also not large family groups in Sydney and Melbourne and large urban areas. There are, but my own personal experience of the group is more rural.
So using your community as an example, does that mean your family lives in one house in a normal neighbourhood in the street and then all of the other families involved in the Truth are also descending on that same neighbourhood?
My personal experience is actually of a farming family. So yeah, my family had farms all within a similar region and we all shared farm machinery. And this is also common with most fundamentalist groups with businesses. They share employees, they share family members to work, they share tractors in rural communities, they all work on each other's farms. So yeah, I come from an environment where our farms were all next door to each other or at least down the road from each other. The ones who did live in town lived within the proximity of each other in a community so that they can get to each other's houses easily on Sundays for services. So yeah, we have our own space and our own homes, but we are also very well, and everything is shared, in turn. Well, not everything, but lots of things are shared resources.
If you're not allowed to do worldly things, it's almost like you're living in the world, but you're in your own little world. Does that mean people from the Truth, they're not nurses, they're not police officers, they're not members of society, they're working in more private kind of family-run businesses?
It does always surprise me how many there are working in worldly professions, but they make a very deliberate effort to stay separate.
Right.
So there are teachers and there are nurses. And certainly for women, there's only very few professions where women can really work outside the home because they tend not to be able, I mean, our hair is so weird. Our clothing is so weird. We don't have a lot of shared vocabulary with the world outside of our community. We're a little bit creepy and freaky. So it is quite hard for us to integrate, especially women who look very different. Men can often mainstream. They wear demure clothes and suits and slacks and polo shirts, but they can actually kind of mainstream a little bit easier than women can. So a lot of women work in jobs that they can fit around their family commitments and our church commitments. There are teachers and nurses, but yeah, there are things like hairdressing is off limits. Things that bring us into contact with too much worldliness is really off limits for us.
I've got to ask, because you've used the term weird to describe dress and hair. Paint a picture for me. What kind of things were you allowed to wear, and what did your hair look like back then?
Well, think of the Mormons in Utah.
Mm-hmm.
You're there, right? Except probably not quite as uniform. When I was growing up, women liked more floral dresses, but certainly there is a preoccupation with being modest. So this idea that you can't show your neckline, your shoulders. When I was growing up, things like toe cleavage were an issue. So you couldn't wear sandals because toe cleavage.
Sorry, toe cleavage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, toe cleavage was seen as being immodest. And like dresses, too long were seen as worldly, too short was seen as immodest. So there's this very like mid-calf length, sort of everyone has this standard mid-calf length kind of dress. Trousers, as read in the Bible, are seen as man's clothing, and women are not allowed to be men. So no trousers or no jeans. Women are not allowed to dress like men. And we're not allowed to cut our hair. Certainly by the time you're 12 or 13, mostly our hair is pulled back into kind of a bun, because to have it too flowy and too showy is to be too worldly.
So were you homeschooled because of all of this, or were you in mainstream schools?
Most truth kids, in fact, all the ones I know of, go to mainstream schools. It is a bit like the rest of our ideology, whereas we're in the world, not of the world. So we're sent to school, but we're very much taught to be very careful about what we believe, and in line with a lot of the secretive nature of the group. We're not very open about our belief systems with the schools and with the teachers, but we are taught that things like dinosaurs are fake, and that we'll be taught things at school that are not real, and we just have to sit there and we have to listen, and then we go home and we pray for those people to be converted and to understand that what they're teaching is false. So we are sent to school, but we are also taught that the things we're learning at school are not true, and that we just have to do it, like lots of things. We have to do it because to survive in the world until the world ends, we need to participate in this.
Was that confusing as a child?
Horribly, very isolating. And we weren't really allowed to make friends with people at school because they were seen as worldly, and we weren't really allowed to participate in extracurricular activities or birthday parties or have close friendships with people. So it was very lonely. And in fact, I often think that being homeschooled might be nicer because then at least we'd be with I was lucky. I came from a very large family. I had siblings and I had cousins and I had lots of other kids around me. Lots of kids, I think, in smaller families of maybe one or two siblings, it can be very isolating to be a child from the truth.
How did your family find themselves as part of this group?
My family have been in for a very long time. On my maternal side, I am fourth generation born inside, I think. On my father's side, or on my paternal side, I'm third generation.
Wow.
So my family's been in a very long time, which further entrenches the issues, which I'm sure we'll touch on later, about leaving, because you don't have any contacts outside the group. Everything you know, everyone you know and love is inside the group. In a nutshell, I believe my family, which I think is common, was preyed on because they were poor, because they were rural, because they had experienced loss and trauma and poverty. They were preyed upon by people in the group and love bombed, which is also something that happens with cultic and high control groups. They love bomb people who are going through periods of distress and who are finding it difficult and not getting what they need, through poverty, through the social security system, through loss and grief and whatnot. My family had been in a very long time.
Did you have a happy childhood?
That's the hardest part for me in reconciling my life in general, is that in lots and lots of ways I had the most beautiful childhood. I came from a farm where I was given free rein to be and to do, and there was no one to judge me. But, I was riding motorbikes in a dress, and riding horses in a dress and running and jumping and skipping. And I had all these cousins and a very big, close-knit family. And I think as a young child, I had a very idyllic life until I sort of got to about 8, when I really then had to start, behaving more and more like a truth girl. I really had a wonderful childhood, very carefree, very practical. I worked with my father and my grandfather around the farm from the earliest age. I rode motorbikes. being a girl from the truth didn't hold me back until I was about 8. And then I realized, oh, okay, there's a behavior that's expected of me now. And that's really when things got very hard, pretty much from then on.
Was it also because you started to look around and realise that other kids were doing things you weren't allowed to do, or that perhaps boys were doing things that you weren't allowed to do?
Yeah, 100%. So then I started looking around and going, why don't I know anything about TV shows like all the girls around me? Why don't I know anything about pop music like all the other girls around me? And, then I started to essentially be sexualized really by the truth, which is like, you can't run and jump like that in that dress. You need to be sitting down and you're being modest, or you'll never be able to get married. No one will want to marry you. And that was a threat held over me pretty much from the age of 8, that if you don't sit down and behave and if you don't set a good example, no one's going to want to marry the girls in our family because you're a bad influence.
Was there an age you were expected to be married by, and was arranged marriage part of the truth?
The truth is a very small group of people, even at its biggest when I was growing up. And so marriage was something constantly talked about, because to find somebody to marry, which I think is common with fundamentalist groups, can be quite a problematic thing because we're all related often. And so, we're constantly on the lookout for someone that might be able to marry our daughters because they're not a second or third cousin. So, it was always a topic of conversation. A lot of my cousins married very young, or at least met their spouse very young at, 14, 15, and were married at 16, 17, 18. So, while there was never an expectation said outright by either of my parents that I would get married, that was what was expected of me by our community and by our family. And, I watched that happen around me, it was just an expectation. I never felt comfortable with it personally, and it wasn't ever what I wanted. But I also didn't really feel, certainly before the age of about 14, that there were any choices. I thought that's just the way it had to be. And the other thing is that the roles for women and girls are so tightly defined, you literally have no other job sometimes. What else are you going to do other than get married and have babies? Or you can go and be a preacher, which we call a worker. And that never appealed to me either. So I didn't want to be a preacher or a worker, and I certainly didn't want to get married and have children, which is really ultimately what led me out of the group.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations Behind the Scenes of Crime Special with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Laura McConnell about growing up in the fundamentalist religious cult, The Truth. Up next, Laura exposes the crimes she witnessed and experienced during her time in the sect and how she eventually left. What did marriage in the truth look like? I guess this is the point where we start to touch on a bit more of the crime aspect of the truth, because domestic violence, was that an accepted part of marriage?
I think it's not even just marriage. I think all of our families are violent, coercive, abusive places. And that hurts me to say because I come from that community and that is my culture. But I come from a culture of embedded violence. I come from a culture of endemic sexual abuse, endemic coercive control, endemic spiritual abuse. People abuse their children physically. I think that has gotten better, but, growing up, all of us would smack our dolls constantly because that's what we saw happening around us. Kids around us were smacked constantly. There's just sexual violence and grooming and abuse was just endemic. And it wasn't just in marriages, it was within family groups. It was our preachers or workers grooming and abusing girls, sometimes boys, but in my experience, a lot of girls. And our distrust of the world outside allowed that behavior and still allows that behavior to flourish because we do not trust, even as leavers, we do not trust authority because we're taught to fear the outside world. There's also no structures inside the group to enable us to report it anywhere. We have no registered clergy. We have no registered organisation. We have no employee processes to talk about clergy who are abusive. So the group itself is not only just spousal violence, it's violence across the board in terms of abuse.
What did you know about sex? Was that something that was taught to you? Because I can imagine when you go into a marriage as a young woman and you're expected to have sex, were you taught that you were allowed to say no, for instance? Or
we have no concept of sexual education and absolutely no concept of consent. Roles for women and girls are very clearly defined. And to step outside of them results in backlash and results in more violence in different ways. You know, you have spiritual violence of Bible verses being used to coerce you, of you being called bitter or being called immodest, or being told that you have a bad spirit for raising issues. You know, and that's not just family violence, that's all kinds of issues. As a woman and a girl, your role is to be subservient. Your role is to follow what you've been told and taught as the interpretation of the Bible and not to ask too many questions. I was very lucky, I think, in that I came from a farming background. I knew what sex was. I knew a lot more than a lot of other kids around me because of the family I came from. My own parents also were not probably as conservative around sexuality and sex as a lot of other parents around me. So I, you know, in lots of ways I was lucky. But no, we are taken out of things like sex education. We are not allowed to do things like learn about dancing, about music, about dinosaurs. You know, like the list of things we're not allowed to know about is never ending.
You've mentioned grooming or like childhood sexual abuse. What can you tell me about how that kind of emerged in the communities in Australia? I know that there was a more high-profile case that actually made the news with 2 preachers from your own community.
Yeah, so we have a very, very big entrenched problem with preachers or our workers being perpetrators of abuse, of abusing power. And then they are not only perpetrating sexual abuse, they're also perpetrating spiritual abuse by controlling people and controlling how people report abuses to authorities. And as I mentioned earlier, there is quite an awakening happening in the US at the moment about exactly how bad the issue is of our workers being involved in sexual abuse and CSA or childhood sexual abuse. I think there's just a massive misuse of power. These people are not trained. They offer themselves to be preachers. They don't go through a formal training. They often just shadow an older preacher or worker for a time, and that's how they learn behavior. They're in an environment where they think that women and girls are subservient to them and that they have control over them. And so, yeah, we have a very endemic issue of men in our community, not just workers, but also senior men, elders in families, being abusers of generations and generations, and then teaching the men under them and around them how to be abusers. That's the reality. It's endemic. And, you know, I've been screaming quite loudly about how bad it's been for, 8 odd years and been shut down a lot by my own community as well as the Leaver community in lots of ways because people don't want to talk about how bad it is. But there is a lot of us who are abused by our preachers or workers, and not only abused but also observed abuse, because the reality is that children in groups, we saw other children experiencing being groomed as well. That's the reality.
So this is something that happened to you personally?
Yeah, correct.
How have you grappled with that now as an adult looking back, that experience?
For me, it's very hard because I often feel a lot of survivor guilt because I grew up understanding a lot about sex, and I also then went on to study at university and to work in areas involving family violence. I always thought that I got off pretty lucky because I wasn't raped. I felt like one of the luckiest people in my family because there were so many people in my family, women in particular, who were abused, who experienced abuse. I just felt like the luckiest kid going around. And then in the last few years, I had this realization that I can probably need 2 hands to count the number of times where I was groomed and where I was sexually assaulted, where I was put in situations where senior men were touching me, where senior men were putting their hands places I did not want their hands, were having sexualized conversations with me, were exhibiting sexualized behavior, like rubbing themselves against me. And all of a sudden I had this realization in the last couple of years, Laura, you were sexually abused.
You were.
You might not have been raped, but that's fucking abuse.
It is.
And not only that, I saw that same behavior happening on my cousins, on other people around me. So not only did I experience it, but I also realized how much of it I'd seen. And it was so endemic and so normalized that we didn't think it was abuse.
How old were you? Do you remember that kind of stuff starting, or can you not remember when it started?
I can't remember when. My earliest instance is around 11.
Right.
But I mean, that's the reality. It's like it probably didn't start then. It's just probably the first time I realized what it was.
Which is terrifying that these kids don't even realize.
No. And I'm also up against that when it comes to raising awareness. That's also why I get so much pushback because people are like, why is she making so much noise about this? Like, we weren't raped. It's not that bad. It's like, okay, I think maybe most of you haven't really clicked about what abuse is.
So these 2 workers from your own community, what were they accused of doing and what happened to them? Are they in jail?
Yeah, so Chris Chandler and Ernie Barry, two men that I came across actually. They came to my community when I was around 13 or 14. And yeah, one of them was involved in allegedly sexually assaulting me. Let's just go with allegedly.
Yeah.
Both those men are dead. So it's a little easier for me to have this conversation and to be a little more transparent about the things that have happened. But both of those men were found guilty. And actually, there are far more victims of those men than have actually ever made it to court because of the way the community really just, most of us are just so terrified of the legal system. And in lots of ways, we have a right to be because our experiences don't fit neatly into a mainstream legal system. You know, it's pretty hard to take a group with no name to court and preachers who don't have an employment record and can say that they're not preachers of anything, because that's what we're up against, right? Like, I think Chris did spend some time in jail. I don't think that Ernie Barry did spend any time in jail. They were both found guilty. But again, the number of cases that could have been brought against them is nowhere near the number they were found guilty of, because people in our community are just too terrified. To speak up comes with extreme consequences often. You know, your own family will disown you, often shun you. People in your community will cross the street to avoid you. People will undermine you. You are left with nothing. You are left with no money and no home and no family. So, yeah, while those two were found guilty, they were not found guilty by nearly as many cases as they should have been. I think Chris spent a small amount of time in jail, but not nearly long enough. And I don't think Ernie spent any time in jail, if my recollection is correct.
What can you tell us about the death of two teenagers in the 90s that, once again, you knew about or you'd been told about? But what were you told about them growing up and what happened to them?
Narelle and Stephen Henderson died when I was, I think, 12, maybe 13. And theirs is a very sad story. They suicided out near King Lake in Victoria. And they wrote a note, or at least Narelle did, saying that they didn't want to attend our church anymore and they didn't feel they had any choice but to attend, and they were being forced to attend. Those details were very much kept from certainly the children in the community, but I suspect also the adults. And we were told that they died because they had listened to Nirvana and they had had too much worldly influence. Yeah. And we believed that. Like, we believed that these poor kids had died because of Nirvana.
Wow.
Not because actually they had tried to say to their mother that they didn't want to attend the church anymore and that they had been forced to attend. It wasn't until many, many years later, like, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years later, that I realised and looked up in a newspaper actually and went, oh my God, they didn't die because of Nirvana, which just seems like ludicrous now. But, often people inside these groups live in an alternate reality. Like, we're drip-fed information. We're told information from a very specific viewpoint. And we're not told the truth about things. Everything is distorted, and even the Ernie Barry, Chris Chandler stuff. When I was growing up and Chris and Ernie, conversations started to happen about the fact that they had been charged. We were told that the people who charged them, were bitter people. They were people with very bad mental health issues. And we were lied to about why these cases were brought about. Like, people are just not told the truth about these criminal cases.
Obviously, we've just touched on a few cases, but are these crimes or alleged crimes that are being repeated over and over and over again in communities, not just here, but throughout the whole world that you can see?
Around the world. And let me tell you, it is worse in countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, and where families are poor. And I mean, we touched on this earlier about my own family coming into the group. The people who come into the group now are from countries like Brazil and Venezuela and Uruguay and Vietnam. And, they're from places where there is entrenched poverty. And they're sending workers or preachers from countries like Australia who have backgrounds as predators into those environments, where I have absolutely no doubt. In fact, I have a lot of emails to suggest that these people are being preyed upon by our workers or by the truth's workers in these countries.
You mentioned before that things are starting to explode overseas. What did you mean by that? Are things starting to come out more?
I think in the US and Canada in particular, there was a preacher who died in a hotel room, and that in itself is very odd because we tend, from the truth, not to go into hotel rooms as preachers. We stay in people's homes, which is also a problem because that's where abuses are happening, because preachers are staying in our homes. So he died in a hotel, and there was some incriminating evidence found on a laptop, and all of a sudden some stuff got shared online in a Facebook group, and lots of people in America started to ask questions about, well, how many predators are there? Do we have a register? We don't have a registered organization. So how do we have a register of predators in the group? And it suddenly became obvious we don't. And There's all these predators just roaming around in our families and communities and in our clergy. And so people are asking questions and they're not getting answers because, as we touched on before, the controlling nature of what gets drip fed in means that nobody ever gets questions answered in a way that is honest.
And I guess it's hard because the police can't really charge anyone or question anyone or prosecute anyone unless people are willing to share what happened.
Correct. And, in my own circumstances, I have tried in the past, and in fact, I have a case live at the moment, to try and get a case up against somebody. But unless you have people in your community who are willing to corroborate your story, you have absolutely no evidence. And when you come from a community who is entirely secretive and who is more likely to undermine you than they are to corroborate your story, the chances of getting a legal case up are even slimmer than they are for mainstream people. And it's hard for mainstream survivors, let alone people from a secretive community like ours.
I've heard you describe the group as putting a lot of emphasis on suffering. Can you describe that to me a bit more? And I'm also particularly interested in it because I feel like what we've been talking about, reporting crimes, that would stop you from wanting to do that too.
I talk a lot about the suffering and a lot about how I left because I couldn't stand the suffering. I have a fairly vibrant, outgoing personality and the suffering just did me in. The reality is this, right, is that life inside fundamentalist groups and life inside cultic groups is actually pretty shit, especially for women and girls and for people outside being a white man, right? If you're a white man, it's a bloody nice place to live. Everything's controlled. You've got a lot of power. You have to wave it around and get people to do what you want. But if you're not a nice white man in a fundamentalist group, it's actually a really hard life. And so to counteract that, you believe that all of this suffering that you're going through, this looking different, this feeling like you are an outsider all the time because you don't look and sound and speak and have any kind of comprehension of the world outside your home, is because you're going to heaven and everyone else is going to hell. And so you're suffering your way into heaven. I just need to suffer and I just need to tolerate this and I just need to put up with this because I'm going to heaven. If I don't, I'm going to hell. There's my alternatives, right? I've got to put up with this because in the end, my reward is in heaven. And you just have this horrible mentality of people thinking they have to put up with horrible mental health issues. They have to put up with abuse. They have to put up with families that are controlling because the alternative is that you're going to hell.
It feels like a way to explain away crimes against themselves.
It is bypassing. It is spiritual bypassing, right? We are using the Bible to basically enable abuse and control by men at the end of the day.
Let's talk about you getting out. Did it start with education? I know that you went to uni. Was that normal?
In theory, it started with me going to university, but I think it goes back much further than that. It goes back with me never being comfortable with my gender and sexuality role within the group, never feeling like I was looking around and thinking, I fit in here. I just never fit in. And if I'd been a boy, and I used to just wish I was a boy from 8 or 9 years old, I used to think, I just wish I was a boy. I wish I could just live like they do. And that's really where it started, is I just never fitted in quite like I should have. I didn't want to get married and just have children and be what the other women around me and girls around me had been. I certainly didn't want to become a worker. And so it was like, well, what are my options? My own mother had been to university, but she'd made a choice to leave and have children. And then she did go back again and become a teacher. And so she did set a good example for me, but she was very much in the world, but not of the world. She was very controlled in her interactions with her colleagues. She kept herself very separate. And she didn't have a life outside the home except to turn up to work and then come home again. And I didn't want that life. I wanted friends. I wanted to experience things. I was a curious kid who wanted to make friends outside our family and community. And really, I had no option at the end of the day. What was I going to do? I didn't have options. And so, I really just nutted down in my last couple of years of school and thought, well, if I can get some decent grades, maybe I can get out of this community. Maybe I can go. So, in theory, university is what got me out, but you've started much, much before that.
How old were you when you finally said goodbye to the church?
I actually didn't formally leave until I was 19.
Okay.
I kept going. I didn't know you could leave. I thought you died and went to hell if you left. I didn't know anybody who'd left. And there were a few people around me who had left in my extended family and community, but I never saw them again. They disappeared. And they disappeared because they were shunned or excommunicated or shamed away. Or in the case of one of my extended family, they actually died. And, that was used against us. We were told if you leave that some accident will befall you and you will die. I didn't know you could leave. I thought I just had to try and maintain this life while building another life outside of it and somehow try and make them work, because I thought if I left, I was going to go to hell.
So did you leave thinking that might happen?
Yeah, I did.
That's a huge thing to take on.
Yeah, the reality is I was really pushed out. I was excommunicated out because my behavior and my appearance and my community, I no longer fitted with my community, was the reality. I was going to university. I wasn't dressing the way I should have been. I had dreadlocks, actually. I refused to cut my hair because we weren't allowed to cut our hair, but I thought I can make dreadlocks with it and I can still, get it up in a big bun with dreadlocks.
You were really working with what you could.
I was working with what I had, but of course I was turning up every Sunday and Wednesday and they were like, what is she? What is this? Like, I was not setting the right example. So I was really pushed out of the community. I thought I was probably going to die. I was waiting to die is the reality for a long time, for 6 odd months. It was the early days of the internet and I started searching online and found some things and started to realize, oh, okay, probably not going to die quite the way they say I'm going to. Yeah. So I left thinking I was going to die.
Do you even remember the first day that you weren't a part of the group anymore? What did that look like?
I don't really remember. I remember the day I realized I was never going back. And I just walked out of a Sunday service and they'd all kind of been very strange with me. There's a lot of rituals at the end of services, like you have to shake hands with everybody. You all sit in a circle and there's a whole lot of rituals that happen in truth services. And I just was really uncomfortable and realizing none of them would look me in the eye. None of them would shake hands with me. None of them would let me participate in the rituals. And it had been going on for a while, for kind of a year, maybe 18 months. But this day I just realized it had escalated and they were really pushing me out and I felt really, really uncomfortable. To the point where they were reversing away from me so they didn't have to talk to me and basically tripping over themselves, to get away from me. And I came to the end of that service and I walked out and it was bucketing down with rain. As I have said before, I didn't have any money. I had nothing. Everyone else had cars and I had to rely on public transport. And none of them ever offered me a lift, which itself was weird because I came from a family and a community that were so tight and, would never have let anybody take public transport and would have given anyone a lift. And so, they just sort of let me walk out and I was waiting in the rain for the tram and it was bucketing down with rain and they were all driving past me and just kind of looking the other direction and refusing to make eye contact with me. And I just sort of went, I don't think these people want me. I don't think I belong here anymore. And I just felt this deep sense of rejection and shame and thought, I'm not coming back here anymore. I don't want this anymore. I don't know what this is and I don't want it. Yeah, and I made that decision that day I'm never going back, never, ever going back. And I was so ashamed and felt so bad that I, was willing to die basically because I wasn't going to participate in that anymore. And it was a pretty tough 6 months after that. I had nothing.
Did you have to call your family and tell them that you were leaving? What did that look like?
Yeah, so I did try to talk to my family about it. Certainly after I'd found information online about the group and about them being cultic and about the abuses, for instance, and about Narelle and Stephen Henderson as well. I found information about them and was like, what the hell? I tried to talk to my family about it, but they would say things like, oh, you've been taken in by the devil. The devil puts things on the internet to confuse people. Your spirit is wrong. You need to go back and you need to repent and you need to come back. And there was a lot of shaming and a lot of thought-stopping stuff. They just wouldn't listen to anything that I had to say. So I stopped really talking about it. But, and it also became gossip because that's the other thing is that our communities are very close. And people would just gossip about me and about my appearance and about my spirit. And then it really escalated to the point where there was kind of ostracization and I would go home to my rural community on holidays and whatever. And people from my community would cross the street to avoid me or pretend they didn't know who I was. Yeah. And, and I'm from a tiny little rural community where these are people I've known my entire life, and these are people I've known since I was born. They would just pretend they didn't know who I was.
And you've described that for the most part, you had a very happy childhood with your nuclear family, but you haven't spoken to them now for many years. Is that right?
Yeah, there was a lot of ostracization, a lot of shunning by my extended family. And not just my family, but my community as well. I think there's been hopeful things. There's more and more who have come forward and made contact after leaving themselves. So that's nice. But, people don't realize the damage that's done to relationships and the damage and the trauma that happens. And even when people leave, it's not always happy families. These are often people who have protected abusers, for instance. even if they leave, they're still not going to go back and say, oopsie, I might have covered up for a predator for you, for somebody. So there's a lot of really toxic behavior still. Yeah, there's a lot of cover-ups and a lot of very damaged people, even if they leave, often still not in a great place.
You mentioned that your first 6 months were really tough. What did trying to integrate into normal society look like?
I'd never worn jeans. I'd never bought a pair of jeans. I didn't know how to buy jeans. I had never been to a hairdresser and had my hair cut properly, like had a hairstyle properly. I didn't know how to use a hairdryer in my family, which is not common. Like I think my family were a bit hardcore about this, but hairdryers were seen as being worldly, so we didn't use hairdryers. So I didn't know how to blow dry my hair. I'd never used makeup. I had absolutely no clue how to use makeup. I wouldn't have known what lipstick or mascara was. I very rarely bought clothes new from a store. I had, a couple of times, but mostly our clothes were made within the family or within the community. So, yeah, just things like shopping for clothes I had no idea about. Wearing things that came above my knee, for instance, I had no idea about. How to use a TV remote, like how to even know what channels are on TV, like pop music. No idea about radio stations, no idea about pop music.
But was learning all of this exciting or was it a bit overwhelming?
Terrifying, because I was also very ashamed, and so to ask for help from the people around me was very difficult. I was very ashamed. So I sort of just had to learn by stealth and by watching and by being hypervigilant with the people around me to try and work out how do you do lipstick? How do you work that remote control? And now that this is common, I think, while the issues might be slightly different now, there's not good deprogramming services for people when you leave. There's just not good counselling that's affordable, certainly, for people to go and learn how to live in the world. We're like aliens from another planet. We might look like other people, but we're like aliens.
Have you been to the police about the alleged crimes that you witnessed or saw happen, or is there no point doing that?
I've raised several different cases with police on various different things that happened. And in fact, my leaving was also a very long, very violent process as well. There was a lot of abuse while I was leaving. Things like leaving notes on my windscreen threatening me. Things like voicemails, leaving threatening voicemails. And, every time I've raised cases with authorities, I've also then experienced another round of violence and abuse. So I have not only raised it about things that happened in my childhood, but I've also, raised cases for things that happened as I was leaving. It's very difficult to prove anything. And as I've mentioned before, the community is very tight-knit and they protect each other. And you need a lot of evidence even to get a case up normally. And there is even less evidence when you have less people who will stand behind you and support you. And it's also part of the reason why I speak out, because when I first started trying to raise awareness and started to have court cases, try and get court cases up, there was nothing available for people to reference when they talked to police online about who the group was. There was nothing online for people to send to a police officer and say, this is the group I came from. This woman is talking about the group I came from. And for me, in the last kind of 5 years, I've just had so many people reach out and say, I raised a case and I sent things I found that you've said online, and I sent it to the detective and I sent it to the police. And I said, this is the group. I'm not making this up. This is the group. This is where they come from. This is their background. Because there was just so little published about us, especially in Australia.
Is that why you've decided to do this interview? Do you just want to keep getting the message out there for other people?
Yeah, I do. I want to get the message out, but I also, bigger than that, I want to talk about spiritual abuse. I want mainstream family violence providers to realise how violent these groups are and how much support we need when we leave, and that deciding to leave is a very long, very violent process, and that we need support. We need housing, we need funding. And at the moment, there just is not supports for people who try to leave our communities.
For a bit of hope, what does your life look like now?
On one hand, I have a really wonderful life. I have a 5-year-old. I have a brand called Go Kindly, a bedding brand that I co-founded and built. I have wonderful friends and wonderful relationships, and I'm very deeply loved in the world that I have created for myself. But on the other hand, I'm also a deeply traumatized person from the things that have happened to me. And I have to hold those things very closely and manage those things. I have CPTSD as a result of the abuses and the sustained abuses. I'm very loved. I have a wonderful life, but it comes with its damage.
I want our final question to kind of speak directly to people. I know it's hard to get access to interviews, but who might be listening to this. They might be members of the truth and they want to get out. what would you say to them?
I think that people need to come to the realization inside the truth that it cannot be changed, it cannot be made safe. It is a dangerous ideology. It is an extreme ideology. It's not Christianity. You can leave and you can go and join a different church, a mainstream church, and still be a Christian. You do not need to believe in the extreme ideology of the truth. It's abusive and it cannot be changed. My advice to people who reach out to me starting to have this conversation is they're usually very terrified, but is to just start gradually exploring what life outside the truth could look like and take very small steps to explore a different church quietly without anybody really knowing, to educate yourself about what supports you might need if you wanted to leave. And that's things like creating yourself your own bank account that's separate from your family's. That's things like thinking about housing and at what point might you be able to get your own access to housing if for whatever reason your spouse or your family did not want to leave with you. What would that safely look like, especially from communities like the one I came from, where leaving would mean they would cross the street and never speak to you again? What are the implications of you leaving, and thinking those things through? And actually going into a family violence organisation and demanding that they listen to your background, because at the moment there are not a lot of family violence organisations who understand the difficulties leaving fundamentalist groups. But you have a right to ask that they listen and a right to ask that they support you.
Thanks to Laura for sharing her story with us. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio designed by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan.
We'll be back next week with a brand new episode of True Crime Conversations, where I chat with former Australian Special Forces soldier Heston Russell about his childhood, his time in the military, and his infamous defamation battle with the ABC.